Well, thank you, Mike, for joining me for this interview about your new book, The Master's Tools. I have a few questions for you, and I'm really excited about this conversation, which will bring the ideas that you've been working on to our Democracy Next audience. I thought before jumping into that, though, perhaps it's useful for a bit of context if you could just introduce yourself and what you're doing, and maybe how you got to be working on these questions about how to democratize finance.
Cool. Yeah. Well, my name's Mike McCarthy. I'm Director of Community Studies and an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And yeah, first I would just say thanks for having me here to talk about the book. I'm really excited about it. But I kind of came to questions around democracy and finance really through um, a lot of research and activism around work that I've been involved in for, over a decade now. I wrote a book before this book, which is called Dismantling Solidarity. And it's basically all about the development of the private pension system in the US and why the 1930s basically created a context in which we had this possibility for a really big, robust public system in Social Security in the United States, a kind of universal public pension system. And in the kind of decades that followed that, we basically saw an increasingly marketized and increasingly fragmented and increasingly kind of employer-based system of retirement. That really has been kind of net negative for working people in the U.S. and that kind of a big part of that story in the book was really kind of how these pools of finance that were essentially workers' finance, right? These massive pension funds that by the 1970s controlled 25% of all U.S. corporate stock, how they were basically funneled into kind of Wall Street investing practices that had kind of net negative effects for workers as a whole. And so, part of that story in Dismantling Solidarity was the kind of the loss of possible control over these investments that working people experience, principally in the 1950s and the 1960s and 1970s in the US. And we actually see kind of similar trends in Europe and other places that have private pension systems. And so that kind of led me in this book to kind of ask the more positive, future-oriented question about how some control might be regained. And that kind of led me down into the path of democracy and what you're so familiar with sortition and different forms of democratic governance.
Mhm. Yeah, indeed. Well, I first came across your ideas actually in an essay that you wrote for Noema magazine, where you were
Mm.
making this case. This was a few years ago before the book came out, around how we could be using these ancient democratic practices like sortition, meaning the random selection of decision makers, to democratize finance. And I thought it was just such an original way of thinking about this idea of democratizing finance. I don't think that's where many people's heads tend to go when they think about what to do about this problem. So, what inspired you to connect these ancient practices with major financial problems today?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. In a way, I kind of stumbled into it because um, I was invited to contribute like a paper to this conference about democratizing finance, right? Uh, and it kind of forced me to think about like how technically would one go about doing that? Like what kind of institutions would you need to actually bring in public voice and decision-making power into investment allocation? And when I started writing this like essay, which is now like old and nobody should read it, but it's there was basically two models out there in kind of in the zeitgeist, right?
Mhm.
Especially on the progressive end of the political spectrum. So you had one model, which is kind of what we typically think of when we think about democracy, which is we just make it public. You create state institutions that are that are um, basically filled with people who are uh, uh, chosen by elected representatives who will then kind of be representatives in those institutions to govern them. So like it could be anything from like bank nationalization, just creating public banks that are run by sort of state bureaucrats. And then on the other side, you had this kind of Occupy Wall Street model of democracy that was emerging and that was really popular in the moment, which were these kind of really big kind of public fora where people kind of anybody could join. There was like consensus processes, and you had like these, this was something that was informing like budgeting experiments in Porto Alegre and lots of other parts. Um, and at the time, I was kind of thinking, these are the two main paths to democracy. You either have like a public state-run thing, or you have like these really bottom-up, grassroots kind of public deliberative, anybody can join processes. And at the time, I kind of realized that like both of these have these major pitfalls. Um, on the public side, like in terms of just a state institution, the problem with that is that states are already not democratic. Like the state institutions, as we know through I mean reams of political science and sociology and empirical studies and theory, is already producing an oligarchic outcome, right? It's already undemocratic. And so simply adding more state stuff doesn't necessarily make it more democratic. It just expands the problem of the state.
Mm.
And on the other hand, the kind of Occupy Wall Street model, while exciting and invigorating in many ways, and I think not positive, has these really profound limitations. One, it's really hard to scale up. It's maybe easy to do on a very, very localized situation where there's not a lot of possible participants. But as you think of something on a bigger and bigger scale, it's just kind of impossible to think about how you would scale that up and have like enough capacity for people to actually participate. And then there's the second issue of like self-selection bias. So the people that are showing up,
Mm.
they're motivated for whatever reason to come to that meeting. And that leads to kind of what a feminist called in the 1980s the tyranny of structuralistness, right? There ends up becoming these leaders that kind of dominate things, but you can't really see that they're doing it and whatnot. And so sortition, random selection, like governance by lot, like I kind of just stumbled into it. It was sort of it was a solution in a way to these two problems. It solved both the problem of elites kind of running things, because random selection or even stratified sampling, where you can kind of select based on income or whatever, you can kind of select out elite overrepresentation. And then on the other hand, it kind of got around these problems of self-selection and the problem of scaling, because you can basically do a random selection at any scale, and if done well, like you're going to get a pretty accurate representation of the population you're trying to draw from. So that's kind of I stumbled into it. I didn't have any pre-interest in kind of random selection or sortition or anything like that. Of course, now I'm like very interested in it. But at the time, it was genuinely a solution to like a problem I didn't know the answer to.
Right. That's super interesting. And I think like also in addition to what you were just saying, there's also the fact that to the problem of we can't all be involved in everything when it comes to trying to scale up. With sortition, you're also kind of rotating who's taking turns going to all of those meetings and so on.
Mm.
So I think that's a different aspect of it. So, okay, so you stumbled into it and you have these critiques of both the traditional representative models, also direct democracy in your book. And so you are proposing kind of a model around this idea based on sortition, also deliberation, of what get called deliberative mini publics in a lot of the academic literature. And so could you explain how these concepts would work in practice for something that's as complex as finance?
Sure, sure. So, I mean, I think at the most basic level, right? And then maybe just describe how it might work in a very basic way, and then kind of add the complexity a little bit. At a
Hmm.
most basic level, a pool of finance, right, is a pool of assets that you are investing, right? And this can be a whole range of different kinds of investments. Maybe you're investing in things like physical assets, maybe you're investing in stocks and bonds. It's just money that a group of people decide, or maybe it's like programs for like credit programs or investing in different public projects. It's just it's a group of money that oftentimes individuals own and decide what they want to do with it. For the vast majority of people who have financial assets, and many people do, obviously the most wealthy have the most. So like the control of the stock market is overwhelmingly in the hands of a small number of people. But still, the majority of I wouldn't say vast, but the slight majority actually of people do own financial assets through things like their retirement plans and whatnot. So most of those pools of assets are governed by asset managers, who are basically people that have a fiduciary duty to invest in those assets that maximize return, right? So they're looking at these pools of assets and they're thinking, how can we invest in ways that can get the biggest return for our buck? And historically, that is basically the way that fiduciary duty has been adjudicated, particularly in the courts, is by looking at what the dominant investment trends are of the given moment. Right? What is considered a good investment today has changed. There's these trends in investment, right? At one point it was just, the blue chip companies, then it's private equity, and then they go through these kind of trends. And so asset managers are kind of looked at and judged, because they have a fiduciary duty, which is a legal thing, against these dominant trends in West and on Wall Street. And so that basically means like all these pools of finance kind of just mimic what like the dominant institutional investors on Wall Street do. And so there are these kind of trends, and the trends kind of reinforce the trends, if you want to think about it like that. Okay, so that's kind of like how it works now.
Hmm.
Um, how would democracy come into this? Well, what if let's take the example of a pension fund, since we've already talked about that.
Mhm.
Right now, the pension funds are again governed by they're invested by asset managers who have a fiduciary duty to maximize rates of return. What if we built into that kind of fiduciary duty the wants, needs, and decisions of the people who are the direct beneficiaries of those assets? So let's say we have a given pension fund. That pension fund has people that are paying into it, that are drawing from it. Um, Maybe it's like for a particular workplace. It might be for a whole sector.
Mhm.
What if we created some ways for the people that are involved in that pension fund to actually have a say over how it's invested? And that's the way in which you can start to bring in democratic processes. One way in which that's been done in the past is you just kind of have surveys, right? You kind of submit surveys to the people that are beneficiaries and see what they think. Or in some cases, the beneficiaries elect trustees to the fund, or there's like election processes where they can kind of have some say on who the board is.
Mhm.
But in both of those cases, nobody, I mean, I wouldn't say nobody, but you get very, very low participation. Like most people are just kind of, when people get those little things in the mail about like um, who you want to elect to your credit union, like, nobody opens those up, right? um,
Yeah.
um, and so so drawing from that group through a kind of random selection process to then bring together a group of people to deliberate over and to make decisions about mandates for that pool of investment is precisely what sortition can do. And it gets it gets to something really profoundly deep and I think very, very important when it comes to thinking about democracy in general, but also democratizing finance. That deliberation process between people helps individuals actually discover their preferences about what their finance is doing in a way that you don't get if you do like, if you ask them to vote for people that they've never even heard of before, or if you kind of just send a random survey. And so on just like the most basic level, democratizing finance means bringing people in to deliberate over and make judgments about how pools of finance should be governed. And these could be pools that people already have a stake in, like a pension fund, or it might be like a public pool. Like if we said, maybe I'm in Santa Cruz now, like let's say Santa Cruz, and there are efforts throughout California to start public banks. But let's say Santa Cruz started a public bank, and everybody in Santa Cruz County was subject to a possible random selection to be drawn together into a large assembly to make recommendations and also decisions about how that public bank should be using its investments in Santa Cruz. That would be a way to kind of really bring in genuine engagement, democratic engagement in sort of a pool of finance with respect to how that finance should be used. Should it be kind of allocated into housing, which Santa Cruz desperately needs? Housing in Santa Cruz is incredibly expensive. It's even more expensive than San Francisco, if you can imagine that.
Wow.
Would it be invested into green spaces, which Santa Cruz has a lot of? Would it be invested into some other thing, right? Like these are the kinds of things that you can do with kind of a kind of assembly-driven, randomly selected body that you couldn't do really with direct democracy or with representative democracy.
With
So
the
that's like,
survey, as you're saying too, because like what you're getting at is that there's also a complexity in these issues, and you don't, in a way, you almost don't really want, or it's not as valuable to know people's top of mind opinions on some of these very complex things, but rather having this process also where they can learn, hear from different stakeholders, weigh the different trade-offs, like even what you were just saying now about Santa Cruz, and if there were a public bank and it was making investment decisions, should it be in housing or green space, etc. Well, those are also underpinned by different values dilemmas about what kind of society do we want to be living in. They're not just technical questions either. So having some form of deliberation, I think, seems to lend itself to a legitimacy that can come from that decision making. And I think a lot, you referenced this at one point in the book too, that a lot of financial institutions today are suffering a crisis of legitimacy as well. Rightly
absolutely.
so, I think. And so this is also, I think, another way of thinking about how they could be addressing that. So I guess in practice, like you mentioned, I think it was very nice that you gave these examples of the pension fund, also of the public bank. It brings some of these concepts which might feel abstract to people listening who also don't have your lovely diagrams in front of you. We will link to those for anyone wanting to go on and look at them. But I guess how to make this work in practice though. So I think one of the other really nice and interesting ideas that was also original that you proposed in your book was this idea of democracy on Fridays. So do you explain what this might mean in practice and how it could transform both our work weeks and our relationship to economic governance?
Totally. So I guess I would say that in the book, there's like the minimalist version of democratizing finance, and then there's the maximalist version. And I don't really sharply distinguish between them. I kind of am going back and forth a little bit. But like the minimalist version would be, let's just create a democratic public bank and see what happens, right? Let's democratize a pension fund. And obviously, this is where any process of democratizing finance would have to start. It would have to start with one thing, right? There's
maybe
like
interrupt you before you go into the example, actually, because for those listening to, like, are there examples of public banks and of pension funds that are doing this, or is this already just in the hypothetical realm?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are tons of examples of public banks,
Mm.
but there are a few examples of public banks that explicitly incorporate democratic processes. So the one that's most cited, and the work of Thomas Merlois is really kind of highlights this example. He has a book called Public Banks, which goes into this example, is the Banco Popular in Costa Rica, which is governed by a kind of assembly that is randomly selected from the different occupational sectors in Costa Rica. So it's like a public bank, and it has a governing board that makes decisions about like its portfolio and and all of the programs that it has in terms of lending programs and credit programs and the kinds of services that it offers to people. And that's basically decided by this governing body of randomly selected. I think it's 290 people. I might be getting that wrong. But that's an example. And another one, which I know you're aware of, is in the Netherlands. There's the pension fund for the retail sector workers, which is a massive fund. And recently, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, they had a random selection process where they drew the pensioners in. It was people that were the beneficiaries of the fund, and drew them in to kind of get to go through a deliberative process about the investments of that fund. This wasn't a binding process where what they recommended was then implemented. It was kind of an experiment. But what they went through with this process, and it should be said that this particular fund, this retail sector fund, is already quite progressive, right? It's like by American standards, for sure. Like they already have guidelines that we would see from our kind of purely financial driven model here in the US as somewhat progressive. The people came together as part of this random selection process, and they determined through deliberation that they wanted it more green. They wanted the investments to have more of a social benefit. And there was an explicit. It's interesting the way folks are calculating. There was an explicit recognition that people would be willing to forego certain returns for certain social benefits. And so I think what these processes are doing is they're really getting people to express what I think is actually quite intuitive to everybody except for the most mainstream economist, which is that people see things other than just returns as being good for them, right? They think like, living in a nice neighborhood, having low crime, having green spaces, having investments that are going to not negatively affect future generations because they produced too many climate catastrophes and disruptions. Like they see this as part of a return, like it's not just like the dollar amounts. And so there are examples.
It's a more expansive view of what do we even mean by returns on investment.
Yeah, exactly. And the reality is that the way our institutions are set up now, not just in the US, but these fiduciary rules kind of govern pools of funds in most places, do not see returns in that way. Like they see returns in terms of the numbers.
Right.
So yeah, there are definitely examples. There are definitely examples.
Yeah, which is inspiring, I guess. So I guess going back to then the question that I had started asking, but not be given you're saying there's also this minimalist and maximalist version and getting a sense of where's the status quo. We do have some examples, and how does that compare also to some of the proposals that you're making in this book and on this spectrum that you're talking about, linked up then to this idea of democracy on Fridays that I do want to come back to.
Yeah. Well, that's like the minimalists, kind of going back to this, and this is not in the book. It's just kind of like my take. A kind of minimalist version would be to have one-offs like this. maybe to have like a public bank in the US. But there have been signs that there's something much bigger than that, possibly, and in my book, I don't really have a full-throated defense of like the maximalist version, but I intuitively and deep down like embrace that. So a maximalist version would be to basically, have most of the most substantial and important financial institutions governed in these ways.
Mm.
So there's a point I make in the book about like how you determine who is selected into the particular financial institution, like the people to participate in the deliberative processes. And
Mhm.
I use this kind of concept from political philosophy, the affected interest principle, which is the idea that like if the decisions that an organization makes affect people, those
Mhm.
people should have a say in those decisions. It's a very simple principle, but the reality is that we live in a world in which organizations, states, corporations, banks constantly make decisions that have massive effects on people that have no say in those decisions.
Right.
And so if we kind of take that principle all the way and we're serious about it, it would mean that we would need like a a much more widespread democratization of of organizations across
Mm.
the spectrum, not even just finance. And so the maximal vision is like how could that even be possible, right? Like this is the one thing that people is will probably always say, like logistically, how could we even imagine that as a possibility? It seems like a logistical um it seems beyond the scope of human design.
Mm.
Um and I guess the kind of the thing that I'm playing with at the end of the book, which is really just kind of it's not a full, not a, I don't really develop it all the way, but just something I'm playing with the idea is the idea that we might, to get there, we might need a day which is kind of dedicated to democratic activity, a day that everyone is a day out of the week, which is sort of like the day for democracy, right? The day in which you participate in one of these randomly selected processes and everyone is like given a wage to do that. It's a day of paid work, but it's a day of like work for democracy, and that's like the idea of democracy on Fridays, where you would have across society there would be this day that everybody is expected to participate in democratic governance.
Mm.
And I think to most, and I don't know, that might strike some people as like I mean, I'm sure it strikes people as strange, but I think it's like quite a hopeful idea, because the idea of like having this day where you participate in deliberation, in sort of a civic duty, in governance, where you kind of talk to people that are not within your social circles, and you learn about people's value systems and how they see the world, and you kind of build connections with people out beyond yourself to directly shape your society. That to me, I think is a pretty, I don't know, I think it's a kind of a hopeful, cool idea. Yeah, so that's kind of what it was all about. It's kind of like, how would we even have the capacity to do something at scale? We would need essentially like a weekly holiday. Like there would need to be like a day that was like the work week would need to be separate. We would need to start thinking in terms of separating the work week from private and work life, to like uh, you know leisure, work life, public life.
Right, right. Well, if you think about how much time people actually have for public life today, it's very little. So,
Mhm.
as much, and I think given the wider political context that we have in many, many countries around the world right now, where there is a deeper reckoning, I think, with the I guess the democratic fabric and how
Mhm.
strong are people's civic muscles. I would say that they're probably not very strong right now either, and that if we're really serious about how do we get to another kind of democracy where we have resilient citizens, where we have robust institutions and processes for decision making that have legitimacy, where people feel they have agency, have a voice in shaping decisions that are affecting their lives. I personally find it a really compelling idea to be taking seriously. And if I zoom out just the scope of democratizing finance for a second, like the work that we're doing at Democracy Next more widely is thinking about if we're going to democratize all sorts of institutions, like for governments. So if we're having permanent citizens assemblies that might exist at the city level, at regional scales, at national level, so that there's many different ones going on an ongoing way with new groups of people addressing different types of issues, but that these assemblies are also a regular ongoing part of governance of things like financial institutions, but also of schools or school boards and universities, workplaces, in corporations or cooperatives, museums in the cultural sector, just to also name some of the kinds of institutions we've already started doing some work with, then I think this makes a lot of sense. And it's a really common challenge that comes up because quite often when these assemblies are happening, they end up being organized on a weekend, which I mean, for many people, that becomes like extra work in some ways. For other people, it becomes challenging to be able to do it because maybe their work is on a weekend. So also, I think having these mechanisms to think through how do we actually even make it possible for people to take up these duties. And we have these kind of mechanisms in place for jury duty, for instance, that if people suspect that they are able to take that up and it's not going to impact their job or whatever, and they can go during the work week. And so I think thinking through these sort of mechanisms, at the moment, I'm pretty sure Belgium is the only country where there's some draft legislation to put something, I think they've called it something like a civic day or like you get civic duty maybe is what it's called. So there's a bit of a resonance with that idea. And yeah,
I think somebody I know of somebody in Germany who's also trying to put something together
oh, okay.
along
Okay.
similar lines. I didn't realize there was something in play in Belgium. That's
Yeah, and now I'll
right.
look up the details of this after because I can't remember if it's at the Brussels regional level or if it's at the Belgian federal level now where that is in place. But there is an active kind of ongoing conversation and some legislation that is being up for debate at the moment around this kind of idea and practice. So it's maybe not as far out or utopian as you might suggest because there's already
Yeah, yeah.
some movement in that direction. And I think if we go back to your vision for that more maximalist kind of democratic finance, I guess you could say. I think there's also some burgeoning interest in those ideas. So you mentioned that there is one Dutch pension fund that has done one-off kind of assembly or jury, I think they called it, or panel, I don't know, with beneficiaries that had lasted for 3 days. And it was a one-off initiative, which I think is really great and shows the sector it's possible. But it would be really ambitious to see if another pension fund might be thinking about doing something that's not just a one-off initiative, where there's also a longer amount of time for deliberation, because, you know, as much as I think that was a really great thing that they did do in 3 days, the level of detail in those recommendations stayed at a pretty kind of high level.
Right.
And so we also know from the wider work kind of for government and policy making that the more time there is, the more detailed people's recommendations are. There was just a report released last week about the French Citizens Convention on Climate that had taken place, which found that the more detailed and precise the recommendations were, the more likely they were to be implemented as well. So
Oh,
anyway, a
interesting.
bit of a tangent now, but I think there's a whole bunch of reasons to think about why it would be great to see some institutions wanting to be more ambitious with thinking about how could we actually shift in a longer term our relationship between like boards and investment committees and beneficiaries to make sure that there is that more ongoing kind of conversation together. Because I think actually, I'm curious what you think about this because this is a slightly different proposal than what you have in the book. But I've been thinking about it because recently I've been diving into the details of how the Permanent Paris Citizens Assembly works and the fact that in the final stages of their deliberations, it's not just the Citizens Assembly that has its recommendations that it hands over to the Paris City Council, which maybe in the context of, let's say, a pension fund, it might be like, okay, here are the recommendations to the board. But the Paris Assembly, they also have joint workshops with elected officials and with public officials working in the administration to get a joint consensus on the final text of the citizen bill that has to be passed. So they're doing also that like joint deliberation work together to reach the joint consensus around it.
Right.
So I wonder if that's also another potential way of thinking about, what could a pension fund be doing? Could it be that they do have a beneficiary assembly, if we might call it that, but
Mhm.
that assembly's recommendations are the basis for a deliberation with an investment committee and the board members to jointly agree on whatever decisions they might have been deliberating on.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's almost like kind of a bicameral system or something, right? There's like
Maybe
these
that's
two.
another way of thinking about it. But what's partition?
Yeah. Although there have been some, like there have been some books that have made that recommendation that there's I guess one book that's on top of mind right now is Camila Vergara's Systemic Corruption,
Yeah.
where she basically makes the argument that we should have this tribunate that is it's like randomly selected from the population through this network of like local assemblies that then has certain checks and balances on our existing legislative system. So like the executive and the different branches of government through like vetoes and through like the ability to kind of like make direct recommendations and the ability to kind of like kick out certain legislators. Yeah, it's an interesting point, and it's like I don't know. There's a way in which these discussions about like the precise institutional design, I just find it really, really fascinating. Also, I find it very difficult to like adjudicate what would be better in many ways.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
there are
kind of
trade-offs involved in those different decisions as well, right?
right.
Hmm.
Totally. Yeah, in the book, I basically make the argument that I'm kind of like a maximalist in the book about like the power of the randomly selected
Yeah.
person, insofar as banks typically have like they have a kind of a board of governors who are basically making all the major decisions, and then they basically the different operational divisions, and that's basically what a bank is, right? And or any for a pension fund, it might be the board of trustees, and then and pretty much that's it. They don't really need operational divisions for a pension fund. But like my argument in the book is that really the kind of experts within the bank, which we will still need, or the experts within the pension fund, which people still need to know how to like invest and like the technical operations that go into maintaining a pension fund. They should really be acting at the behest of somebody else. They should be governed by mandates, right? They should be governed by democratic mandates. And that to me is really where the heart of the assembly is, right? The assembly that kind of comes together, meets over a period of months, kind of looks at existing mandates, adjudicates between possible alternatives, and then makes kind of binding recommendations, binding decisions that basically the experts then need to implement. There's ways for me, democratizing finance, that alone wouldn't be enough. I don't think you would to have it reproducible, to create a system in which it could reproduce itself over time. It's not just going to be something where you just create some mandates and then that's it, and then democracy has been achieved. It needs to be something that is renewed, and there are processes that kind of keep it going. And so one of the ideas is basically having a research jury where, let's say the assembly comes together, right? And it's basically working with things that it's gotten from past assemblies and from past research juries. And it's trying to make decisions on investment allocations or on the different programs of, let's just stick with the idea of a bank. And there are certain things that it just doesn't have enough information about. Like it doesn't have, somebody from the citizens assembly process, or maybe a group of people raise something as like an important issue that they want to kind of think through, but they just don't have enough information, and there's not enough time to figure it out. And the people that are facilitating it didn't kind of come prepared to address that particular thing. Well, there's a possibility if we had like a randomly selected research jury of basically kicking that over to the research jury to kind of come with basically a broad series of possible directions on this thing that could then go back to the next citizens assembly process when it happens, in whatever time iteration it might happen. Um, and so there's some different kind of like institutions that I kind of build into like the democratic model for finance, which we're kind of get to the idea that we should be thinking about like what are the functions of these different deliberative bodies? What are they trying to do? One of the things that I don't know, I find really fascinating. This kind of writing this book led me to go back and read a lot of stuff about ancient Greece, which I'm not a classicist, but like I nonetheless was, going back and reading Aristotle and different like historical texts, and ancient Greece was by no means not an ideal place, but it was one of the things that was striking to me was the way in which they basically had randomly selected groups of people for all sorts of different basic functions in Athenian society. So it was the people that were like maintaining the temples for festivals, cleaning them. It were people that were maintaining roads. It was around, of course they had juries, which we still have today, but it was also people that were maintaining prices in the markets. There was like randomly selected groups of people so that, if you needed to hire a harp player for your party, like the price was regulated by these like randomly
You got a
selected.
fair price for your harp player.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But they had the intuition that there are different types of decisions and different types of needs that we have that need to be fulfilled, and we should create kind of democratic institutions that fulfill these needs. And I think that's in a way how we should be thinking about democratic finance. That it's not simply that we need a democratic assembly that will create mandates for pools of finance. We need that, and that's a very important first step. But there's all sorts of other needs that go into governing a pool of finance, and we should think about in what ways could we actually democratize those needs. Yeah. And so that's how I think we should perhaps think about democracy more broadly, right? Like there are different things that we need to do to govern our society. Making broad decisions about policy is one, but there's lots of other things that require decision making and deliberation. And how can we create different kinds of democratic institutions to actually achieve those aims?
Yeah, and I think like what you're saying also speaks to how it completely shifts your perspective if you're thinking about wanting to do some one-off initiative to maybe pilot something with a randomly selected group of people, like the pension fund that already did an experiment which, I don't want to downplay it because they're one of the first, and we need people to show what's possible and so on. But at the same time, there's also just a limit to how you're approaching it because you're thinking of it through that perspective of like this one initiative. Whereas if you're thinking of it in that more long-term institutional way about really democratizing the institution, then that opens up, I think, a much more complex view about, well, what are the different types of decisions? What are the rules? What are the relationships then between these different bodies? And we've seen that with the permanent assemblies that have been established for government and policy making, for example, that there's often a much more complex structure with them where there's actually those assemblies tend to have their own governance bodies. There's also often a connection to an agenda setting body. There's a connection to a different follow-up committee. So you start to see this much more as a system. And I think that you really pull out that same sort of ethos in what you're suggesting here for the financial sector as well.
Yeah. And I don't know. In a way, I think we're in a moment historically where I think we should just be really, really bold about these things. You were talking about legitimacy earlier. We're in this moment where like there's just like a complete loss of legitimacy in public institutions. and not just public institutions. There's a complete loss of legitimacy in private institutions as well.
Hmm.
If you in the US, and I'd be curious to see these numbers elsewhere, but I have this the sneaking suspicion that it's probably similar. But in the US, if you kind of poll Democrats and Republicans on a whole range of their opinions of different types of institutions in the society, they're basically on opposite ends on a wide number. So like institutions of higher ed, they're on polar opposites, right? Democrats think they're legitimate, Republicans don't. Church, they're on polar opposites. Democrat illegitimate, Republicans legitimate. There's all these different kind of institutions where they're completely divided. But if you look at the institutions where they've completely converged, it's on large corporations, banks, and the state. Right? It's like the basically these, the most powerful organizations in society, people have, for the most part, most people have lost complete legitimacy in them. They don't see them as valid, and they see them as like self-interested, nepotistic, and causing harm to the world. And so I think we're in a moment where not only do we fundamentally need democratic processes to kind of to help create kind of a common sense of purpose, to fight against polarization, to actually democratize these institutions, which are run by oligarchs. But there's like a space to do it in terms of our culture. There's an intervention to be made, I think, right now, which might not have been possible a couple decades ago, where like because of the moment that we're in, where people are like searching for a big alternative.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree. And I would be interesting to see what those figures are in other countries. I would not be
Mhm.
surprised either if there was a similarity in terms of a general sense of agreement, regardless of maybe political divisions across party lines on different types of issues. Um,
Mhm.
well, I realize that our time has actually flown by. I had a couple more questions, but I know that we're needing to wrap up now. So maybe just like a very last one to end things on in the next few minutes, to give people a sense of, well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that throughout your career, you've also moved between doing academic research on these topics, but also more practical policy work and even like the advising and things you've done with the Public Bank LA. And so how has this dual perspective shaped your vision of democratizing finance and the lessons that you've taken away about how do you actually implement these ideas in the real world?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it's worth saying. I've worked a bit with Public Bank LA, which is a group that's trying to establish a public bank in Los Angeles, and it's part of a broader California public banking coalition. The the one that's probably furthest along in establishing a public bank is in San Francisco, but there's others, and there's also a national coalition, which is trying to public banks are trying to get started in places like New York and in other parts of the U.S. Uh, and that work in some ways, it kind of got me involved in some legislative work. So at one point, I helped consult a bit on a bill that was submitted to Congress in 2023, which is the Public Banking Act. It was submitted by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and AOC were the primary. They're the primary authors of the bill. And that bill basically, which is kind of hasn't gone anywhere in Congress given the composition, but like it basically creates a framework for creating a national level framework for creating public banks, in which at a national level banks would be supported in anything from like states to municipalities to like tribal territories.
Mhm.
And a key part of that, which I helped kind of craft in some way, was that for banks that have a capitalization, which is the total assets essentially of a bank, which is more than 500 million, they would need to do some kind of assembly process, drawing from the region that that bank covers to kind of help create mandates for the bank's programs. And so there's like these, there are things going on like on like a national level. We see so much, horror in the news today that rightly hides these things from view. But there's real momentum, I think, within certain sectors of politics in the US to kind of move these things in the right direction.
Mhm.
And I guess, I don't know, for me, like working in that world a little bit, which is a much more alien world to me than like reading books and writing about them, to be perfectly frank.
Uh-huh.
Um, it has kind of given me like a better sense of the practical possibility
Mhm.
involved in these things, and it has given me a sense that it is actually possible to ratchet up these things to the more maximalist version that we were talking about earlier, right? I think
Yeah.
in some ways, social theorists, political theorists, and things, we talk about these wild, crazy alternatives, but do we really believe that it's possible deep down inside, right? Like it's like I actually do. Like I like thinking, like working with these different groups and seeing the kind of that side of things. I think it's given me kind of a more realistic awareness that it is actually realistic. That it's not just something that I'm writing about in theory. It
Mhm.
is actually something that could be achieved in practice. And so I think that's the way in which it's maybe informed. It's also, I don't know, working in that world has also directly informed the ideas in the book. So there's some really great organizations like Democracy Collaborative in the US. Also, Commonwealth is another one in the UK. Some different organizations that have been really involved in in putting together like very very kind of practical white papers that would lay out like how different forms of democracy would be instituted in banks and things like that. And that work has like directly informed like what I do in my book.
Mhm.
So like being in that world, I think has been really crucial.
Yeah, what you're saying really resonates because I guess also the work we're doing at Democracy Next more generally as like a research
Mhm.
and action institute, there's these 2 feet, like one in academia and one in the policy, and also, well, maybe if there was a third foot in a political world, because they're not always the same. There's sort
Mhm.
of more policy-oriented conversations amongst like the think tanks and the wonks and the public servants. And you also need to have the political buy-in for these ideas to advance. And I think being able to connect the dots of those is actually really powerful. And I really want
Mhm.
listeners of this to come away also realizing that your book is both like, well, it's super engaging and ambitious and putting all these original ideas out there, but also that these are really possible. Another
Mhm.
democratic future is possible. And especially when we kind of get that agency to just try to make these ideas happen, then we're able to do that. And it
Mhm.
feels really exciting, especially in the wider political democratic moment that we're living right now.
Totally. And can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Um, I should have mentioned that like Democracy Next, it has, I think it's been like the work that you've done in particular has been incredibly important to my perspective. So I mean, the one of the first things that I read, which I think really shaped my sense of possibility was the report that you did with the OECD, basically like laying out like the kind of variety of ways in which these processes are being instituted, like in different parts of the world.
Mm.
Um, and kind of the many of the kind of the things that you've put out and the kind of the ideas that you've helped promote, like kind of really gave me a sense that like this is practically possible. And so yeah, I would just I failed to mention that before, but I think it's actually like what you're doing is probably kind of it's in some ways the kind of center of this whole kind of movement, which
Oh,
I
thank you.
which I think I mean for me, I can't speak to everybody else, but like for me, like I think what you've done is like absolutely fundamental. And so like I just really appreciate the insights that I've got from your work, and yeah,
Well, I
it's
appreciate it.
genuinely
I was not pushing
invaluable.
for compliments with that, but I quite like how you said though that because I do see what we're doing as part of a movement or trying to grow and amplify a wider
Mhm.
movement of this. Well, at the OECD we called it catching the deliberative wave, and it does feel
Right.
like there's a wave. There's an energy to it. Somehow it's also organic but powerful. And how do we harness that energy towards kind of continuing it to grow? Is a little bit
Yeah.
how I see it. And we're one actor, but I see it as also like trying to propel a wider ecosystem of other organizations and people to be able to take these ideas and apply them in all sorts of ways. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would go a step further. I don't think you're
Okay.
just riding the wave. I
Okay.
that implies a kind of passivity on your part. Like you're like a surfer just kind of riding the
That's
wave.
true.
I think you're going further. Like one, you're helping understand what the wave is. Like your work has like been really amazing at doing that. Like to really clarify precisely what's happening. But two, you are like you kind of said amplifying, which I think is right. You are somehow infusing the wave with greater with greater size. So so yeah, I don't know. I think yeah, I don't I would go further than saying that you're catching the wave. I think you have more of a your organization has played a more pivotal role.
Oh, well, thank you, Mike. And it's been nice to have you involved also as our Economic Institutions Fellow to bring the ideas you're working on and connecting the dots between this. So I'm going to kind of wrap things up now and thank you for your time. And I will really highly encourage all our readers and listeners to read your book. I'll also make sure that we pop all the relevant links to the organizations and the different papers and stuff. Yes. The master's tools in reference to a great quote, which I was going to ask you about, but there's only so many things we can talk about in an hour. But thank you, Mike. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this interview with us, and it's a real joy to be working together on advancing these ideas forward.
Definitely. Thank you.